Hello everyone. My name is Evie Wolfa, and I am the current president of the JSSS. And welcome everyone to the JSS Online. This is a series of events and discussions offered by the Jungian Society for Scholarly Studies by the JSS members. Today we have our second event. And it is with Greg Mahr, who is medical doctor, and Chris Drake, doctor. Unfortunately, Chris cannot be with us today, but we are really in safe hands with Greg. Both of them, Greg Mahr and Chris Drake, have published a book by the title The Wisdom of Dreams, Science, Synchronicity, and the Language of Soul. And this is what Greg will be talking about. Greg is a psychiatrist. He's also a teacher and a writer. He is a director of Consultation Liaison Psychiatry at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. He's an avid writer, has published flash fiction and poetry in a variety of medical and literary journals. Chris Drake is the director of sleep research program at Henry Ford Hospital. He has published over 200 clinical papers and has received multiple research grants from National Institute of Health for his work on sleep. Greg will speak for about 40 minutes today, and then we can talk. We have time for questions and answers. If you have any questions, you can already type them in during the talk time in the chat area, and we will also use the chat area during the Q&A time. As you know, the talk is recorded. It will be made available on our YouTube channel. The QA part will not be made available, so that you will feel safe during the QA time. Greg, without further ado, I hand it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. So I will screen share. Everything always goes perfectly when you're practicing, but then anyway, I'll just use this view. This is the subject will be kind of an overview of the project we did on dreams. It's probably worth starting with kind of the story of the book. And it's interesting that people mentioned the interest in Jung in Europe, because that's not the case here at all. Like most people here have no knowledge whatsoever of psychodynamic psychotherapy. And if they know a little bit about that, they will know nothing about Jung and have like a vague negative idea of Freud. So I've kind of taken it a bit upon myself to be kind of a missionary from the inside, as it were, of depth psychology in my world where Jung is not well known. So the book has some of that flavor, that missionary flavor, because I want to introduce people in the psychological culture here to that. So the actual story of the book is a bit of synchronicity. I'll start a little bit earlier. I had a heart attack about 12 years ago now. And I was always interested in Jungian stuff and depth psychology, but I never actually pursued it. But then after that, I decided to kind of do what I wanted more. And actually the first thing I did was buy the Red book. That was actually my first thing I did when I got home. So then fast forward about 4 or 5 years, I get invitations from different parts of the hospital to talk about this and that. And I got an invitation from the sleep clinic to talk about a typical kind of topic I'm asked to talk about, screening for depression in insomnia patients. And I kind of looked at the invitation. I thought, oh, geez, this sounds really boring. I don't really want to do that. So I called the person who invited me, and I said, this topic is kind of a snoozer. How about if I talk to you about dreams? And to my surprise, she said, yes, go ahead. And so I did a talk about dreams. And in the audience was a former colleague of mine that I'd barely spoken to in 20 years. He was actually a psychology intern of mine long time ago. And he actually joined the lecture because he saw my name and he hadn't talked to me in a long time. So that was Chris. And he's a big sleep researcher, big expert on insomnia and sleep apnea and things like that. So, but he came to my talk and we started talking afterwards, and he started telling me about his lucid dreams, and we started talking about dreams, and it turns out he was kind of having a midlife crisis of his own, and he had been very productive in this world of sleep academia, but that wasn't really where his heart was. You know, he always wanted to study dreams, but there wasn't any money in that. So our interests, our kind of mutual midlife crises kind of meshed, and we started talking and having lunch and so forth, so that the book kind of grew out of that. And the meshing of our two perspectives, I think, was really important, because he brought a science perspective and he brought a credibility in the academic world, but he knew nothing about dream interpretation or Jung or anything like that, where I brought that perspective to the book. So it was a very rich collaboration. So I'm going to move on to the book is kind of, so that's part of the goal, is to inspire and inform people in my world about depth psychology. So the book is structured by, each chapter begins with a dream and ends with kind of an exploration and discussion of that dream. And that structure really guided the book. It almost felt sometimes like the dreams wrote the book, because like when I found the right dream, the chapter would kind of write itself. It was kind of a very interesting process. So let me just go on to a few selected topics. First of all, sleep. It's interesting to look at how sleep has changed in our time versus what it probably was like years ago. One thing we've created with our electric lights and electronics is a world of endless summer. When you think about before the time of electric lights, in the northern hemisphere, for instance, in the winter months, you would have long periods of night, long periods of darkness, 14, 16 hours of darkness, where people couldn't do anything when they didn't have electric lights. I mean, you can do a little bit with a campfire or a lantern, but not really. So when people have long night periods like that, their sleep is very different. The sleep cycle tends to break up into two halves. They tend to sleep for 5-6 hours, wake up for 2-3 hours, and then go back to sleep. It becomes this biphasic pattern. We try to cram all of our sleep conveniently into this narrow window. which may not be how we're really designed. And the reason the cave paintings are in the background, besides the fact that I love that picture and thought it was a really cool picture, is that a lot of people think that the cave paintings were made in that middle period of night where people were up, they couldn't do anything. So there's some evidence that was the time when they took lanterns into the depth of the cave and did their artistic work. And it's also, I've talked to a number of artists, especially writers, and I hear pretty regularly that they write the best in the middle of the night. I have a poet friend in San Francisco, and he deliberately sets his alarm at 2 a.m. every night because he finds that at that time he's more creative and almost like he accesses different parts of his brain. And of course, electronics keep us up also. And besides the endless summer that we do with our electric lights, and because we try to cram all of our sleep, our bodies don't always want to do that. So then we add to the problem by using tranquilizers and sleeping pills. 1/6 of the US population is on medications that suppress dream sleep or REM sleep, from antidepressants to hypnotics. And those are just prescription medications. So I'll move on a bit to a discussion of nightmares. This is a well-known painting by Henry Fuseli. He actually did several very similar ones, but there's one in the Detroit Institute of Arts of that particular image. And you see a couple interesting things about the image. You see it's a little blurry. You see, of course, the horse because it's a nightmare. But you see this demonic figure sitting on the woman's chest, which is often a feeling people have when they're sleeping. One thing that happens in REM sleep, which is very important in the physiology, is that you're literally paralyzed in REM sleep. The body's just designed that way that when you go into REM sleep, the motor system becomes unplugged. So when people wake up, and nightmares are typically at the end of the night where you have longer periods of REM sleep, and typically that's when you end up having nightmares. So you sometimes will wake up, especially from a nightmare, when you're still paralyzed. So you'll have the experience of sleep paralysis, of not being able to move. So this is an example of a nightmare. First, I was surprised, but right away I got real scared. I was lying in bed. I was so tired because I was working very hard. I had to get to school, but I had no money. I kept waking up because I was thinking so much about my problems. I heard a noise, but I could not move. My bedroom looked the same. I could see in the mirror a dark shape was coming towards me. It came to my legs like a heavy weight over my whole body, my chest. My chest was frozen like I was trapped. I tried to yell, hoping someone sleeping close to me will hear. I tried to move using a force that I can, a strength that I did not have. What if I die, I thought. After a time, it went away. I just got up and turned all the lights on. I was afraid to sleep again. That fear of sleeping again is very important. This was a dream by a Hmong immigrant. The Hmong are, if you're not familiar with the Hmong population, the Hmong are a people that live in the mountainous regions of Vietnam and China, and they assisted US forces in the Vietnam War. And after the Vietnam fell, a number of Hmong emigrated to the US, and they lived in small communities, but they were isolated from their own culture and their own traditions and so forth, and they struggled financially. And what started to happen is there was this epidemic among the Hmong of the sudden death among young males, and it even got an acronym, SUNDS, sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. And some cardiologist, in a very American Western kind of way, who decided, gee, we should probably put pacemakers in Hmong males to help them stay alive. With nobody ever actually talked. They couldn't speak Hmong, and nobody really asked them what was going on. But finally, years later, people explored the situation more, and people who could actually speak Hmong. And what seemed to be happening is in their isolation, the Hmong would get these terrible nightmares. They interpreted this sleep paralysis as like a presence of evil in their lives, and especially a presence of unappeased deities that they couldn't satisfy with their usual rituals. And because those were more the roles of the male, it seemed to affect males much more. And they became very, very afraid to sleep. And they would keep themselves awake because they were so afraid of these nightmares, and these long periods of sustained wakefulness was probably what was causing the cardiac problems and the sudden unexplained nocturnal death. And this also became famous in popular culture because there were some articles written about this in the Los Angeles newspapers, because there was a significant Hmong population there. And the filmmaker Wes Craven read those articles and got the idea of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, where if you've ever, they're older now, but there's a whole series of them, horror films about a figure haunting people at night. Right. Pardon? And people were very afraid to sleep. So that's the origin of that. So what seemed to be happening with the Hmong is a misinterpretation of the dream as a moral judgment. And if they had our understanding of the physiology of the dream, that might have helped them understand their experience, and that ended up being the part of the problems that they had. Move on to another topic. The dreams and creativity, a more cheerful topic. And let me read another dream. So I'm kind of following the format a little bit, because each chapter starts with a dream. This is an interesting dream. It was two people in a kind of a little circular meadow with really beautiful sunlight. One of them was a beautiful, sparkly boy, and one was just a girl who was human and normal. And they were having this conversation, said Stephanie Meyer, about her dream. The boy was a vampire, which is so bizarre that I'd be dreaming about vampires. And he was trying to explain to her how much he cared about her, and yet at the same time, how much he wanted to kill her. And this was described, this is the origin of the Twilight series of books and movies, as described by Stephanie Meyer on an episode of the Oprah Winfrey Show. Just as kind of an interesting sidelight, the books set off these dream stories as epigrams, like indented differently in the beginning of the chapter. And then when it was all written and all submitted, the Rutledge told me, oh, by the way, you can't do that. If it's set off, it's considered the same as an illustration. So you can't do that. So so I had to go back at the last minute and try to get permissions from everybody to use this as if it were an illustration. But the nice story is one of the easiest permissions to get was from Oprah's people. Surprisingly, I wrote them. They responded almost right away, and they just asked to read the chapter, and then after they read it, they said fine. I don't think they even charged me anything. So that's, if you remember, that's Edward and, oh, I can't remember her name, but he's the vampire and she's the human figure. So other creative discoveries that happened through dreams. I know this audience, many of you are probably familiar with these stories, but Paul McCartney famously woke up one night with a progression of chords and a melody in his mind. And he kept thinking it was some song he had heard somewhere. And he kept asking his friends, "Do you recognize this song?" And everybody said, no, they never heard that. And that turned out that he had dreamt the song Yesterday, which is one of the most popular Beatles songs. Keith Richard of the Rolling Stones, similar story. He was strumming his guitar in bed with a tape recorder beside him, fell asleep, forgot to turn off the tape recorder. And when he woke up in the morning, he decided to just play the tape, and he heard the music that is eventually became Satisfaction, one of the biggest Rolling Stones hits. Other examples are Mary Shelley with Frankenstein. Interesting part of the Mary Shelley story is there's often a sort of distress and anxiety associated, because Mary Shelley was with Byron and some other friend, her future husband Percy Shelley, and other friends who were accomplished poets and writers. Mary Shelley was like 17 or 18 at the time, without any significant writing experience. So they decided, as a fun game, Byron said, let's everybody write a horror story and then we'll share them, because it was raining. And Mary Shelley went to bed like really anxious that, how am I going to write a horror story that these famous writers are going to like? What am I going to do? And that was the night she dreamt Frankenstein. Kekulé was the organic chemist who discovered the structure of organic molecules through the dream, the same way Mendeleev and Einstein had dreams that were very significant in their careers. So what's going on? Why do these kind of things happen? Dreaming seems to involve the suppression of the default mode network, which people think more of neuronal systems not as like anatomical units, but more as connected networks that fire together. So one common network that people kind of think metaphorically of as the ego is the default mode network, because that's the sort of the mode you're usually in when you're just awake but not doing anything particular. And a lot of the job of the default mode network is suppressing other noise so you can relax. But what happens in dreams is the default mode network shuts off, so you have more associations and more shared things that aren't normally in awareness come into awareness. It's just kind of a cool, artistically nice picture of neural networks, very extremely complex, obviously, but this is a good picture of the normal brain on placebo and the brain on psilocybin, the massively increased connectivity, which is very analogous to what happens in dreams. This is what Kekulé, the organic chemist, when I mentioned that he discovered that carbon ring through dreams, he didn't dream of a carbon ring. He dreamt of an Ouroboros. So he dreamt an ancient symbol. So it's like the mind speaks not in its own language that our conscious mind isn't used to. So he had to make the connection between Ouroboros, oh, carbon ring, that's the answer. Interesting when the more you think about it, there's probably a much deeper message in that, because I think the mind picks out those archetypal images trying to say more. So the mind was probably trying to tell Kekulé, no, remember, it's not just about the carbon ring, it's about regeneration and matter and all those deeper issues as well. When you think about, there's deeper archetypal elements in all those dreams, like Twilight, the Stephanie Meyer's dream. It takes place in this mysterious circular meadow with these lights, and there's obvious archetypal elements in there. This animus figure, and being a vampire means living forever and dying, but in the collective unconscious. It's interesting when you start to think about it from an archetypal language. And dreams also, in a very beautiful way, connect affects and emotions and have a unique power in that way. This is another famous dream by William Dement, who's a big name in sleep research. He's the discoverer of REM sleep. He was a chain smoker. And one day he had this dream. I was coughing into a handkerchief and noticed with a chill that the little flecks of sputum on the white cloth were reddish pink. I sought a radiologist friend and asked him to order a chest x-ray. I will never forget the grim expression on his face as he motioned me to the light box behind his desk. Without a word, he turned and clipped my chest film onto it. Immediately, I saw that my lungs harbored a dozen white spots, cancer. The wave of anguish and despair I felt was overpowering. I could hardly breathe. My life was over. I wouldn't see my children grow up. All because I hadn't stopped smoking. And even though I knew all about smoking and lung cancer, you utter fool, I thought, you've destroyed your life. And Dement never smoked another cigarette after this dream. Now, he, of course, knew that cigarette smoking caused cancer, but the dream was able to connect this cognitive knowledge with his affects in a very powerful way that he hadn't experienced before. The interesting, deeper question that comes from that I don't have an answer to was his conscious awareness necessary for that? I mean, if he hadn't remembered this dream, for instance, would it have had the same impact somehow? So the function of dreams seems to be to link memory and affects and feelings in novel ways, creatively synthesized. We kind of developed an acronym which we called NEAR, because dreams also involve the creation of a narrative. So it's narrative expansion and affect or archetypal reintegration. We're trying to be cute. We spent a number of chapters talking about different cultures and how they experience dreams. And our culture is kind of unique in being historically rather negatively predisposed to dreams. I've spent a fair amount of time exploring the history of that. And if you search online, for instance, like something like Christianity and dreams, you'll typically get a bunch of negative stuff like religious websites talking about the dangers of dreams and stuff like that. So I started wondering where this all came from. And I found this story. St. Jerome was an important leader of the early church. He became severely ill and he had a terrifying dream. In his dream, he was tried in a heavenly court and accused of being a follower of Cicero. Cicero was a Roman philosopher from the 1st century and not a Christian. And for this crime, he was horribly whipped. Now, Jerome was a very bright guy, but I think a little bit concrete. And he interpreted this dream not internally as we might now. If he had had a good analyst, then the analyst might have told her, geez, it's your internal critical figures that are flogging you and you need to open yourself up more. But Jerome interpreted himself differently, very concretely. He interpreted that he's a bad person because he's interested in classical philosophy like Cicero is, and that he's got to stop doing that completely. So he was very upset, locked himself in his room for a couple of weeks, came out, burned everything he had, all his collections of books, and decided to completely disavow classical learning. And this is an old painting. There's Jerome and all the temptations of life and art and music. Because there is a tradition of meaningful dreams in the Bible. There's 12 dreams in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, 7 in the New Testament. Joseph and Daniel were great interpreters of dreams, and that's how they became famous, and how they indicated their divinity in a sense. The important dreams in the New Testament. And early church fathers like Augustine, Origen, Ambrose, and Ignatius all valued dreams. And Cicero, he was a strong advocate for the Republic rather than the empire, and he was murdered by Mark Antony. And Jerome identifies with this internal autocratic figures representing empire, and kind of turns away from this internal feminine energy. So what the practical consequences of that is, Jerome created a translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, which was, he was in 300 AD. The Vulgate was his interpretation was in pretty common usage until the 1950s and 60s. So we're talking 1300 years. And interesting thing about his translation is that he mistranslated the Greek word anon, which means witchcraft. And he mistranslated it on 2 or 3 occasions as observing dreams. So in his version of the Bible, there's couple passages then where you should avoid sorcery and avoid this and avoid observing dreams, which isn't what was said at all. He mistranslated this word. And a lot of people think it wasn't just a mistake because he mistranslated it correctly 8 times and incorrectly twice. And why is that? So a lot of people think he intentionally distorted the biblical translation because of his fear of dreams, because of that negative experience and his negative interpretation of his own dream. I'm going to skip some of this a little bit. I'll just show this image because it's kind of cool. I have some other chapters about Christianity and the Black Madonna. I'll share this dream because it was such a cool dream. I often dream about falling. Such dreams are commonplace to the ambitious or those who climb mountains. Lately, I dreamed I was clutching at the face of a rock, but it would not hold. Gravel gave way. I grasped for a shrub, but it pulled loose. And in a cold terror, I fell into the abyss. Suddenly, I realized that my fall was relative. There was no bottom and no end. A feeling of pleasure overcame me. I realized that what I embody, the principle of life, cannot be destroyed. It is written into the cosmic code, the order of the universe. As I continued to fall in the dark void, embraced by the vault of the heavens, I sang to the beauty of the stars and made my peace with the darkness. This dream was by Heinz Pagels. And Heinz Pagels was a physicist, and he was, his big area was chaos theory. He wrote a couple very well-received books about chaos theory, and he was, some of which were fairly popular. He was actually the figure in Jurassic Park that was played by Jeff Goldblum. He was talking about chaos theory in that movie, and that was Heinz Pagels. Sadly, he, about 4 years after this dream, he fell off a rock while mountain climbing and died from a fall. So his dream is strangely beautiful, strangely prophetic. The other weird coincidence is that his wife is Elaine Pagels, who's a well-known biblical scholar and the author of the Gnostic Gospels and several books about Gnostic Gospels. So I talk about some interesting connections about Gnosticism and kind of the shadow aspect of Christianity. Yeah, the first, we forget that the first crusade in Christianity wasn't against Muslims in the Holy Land. It was against the Cathars, which were a French Gnostic subgroup, and they're slaughtered mercilessly. There's actually a famous story from this first crusade where the general from the papal army conquers a city of about 8,000, which was Qatar, held by the Qatars, and he I was going to say emails. He didn't email his commander, but he sent a message to his commander saying, gee, what do I do? I've got all these people. I can't tell who's a Catholic and who's a Qatar. They all look the same. And his commander says, oh, just kill them all. And he does the famous quote, God will sort it out. So it was a very cruel crusade. There's interesting prophetic dreams. There's one that a child had in just before this terrible mining accident in Wales, where her school was somewhere there, but she dreamt of it a couple days beforehand. Most of these things aren't as important for you guys, for this audience. Tips for remembering dreams: respect your own biorhythms, avoid endless summer, make recalling dreams a ritual. And you don't need this guidance, but as a therapist, value dreams. It's interesting that most therapists don't do that at all. And 60% of patients or clients going to therapy, even when they're seeing a behavioral therapist who has no interest in dreams, about 60% of them will share dreams. It's like they know that they're important. And just the last 1 minute, we're doing, Chris and I and a couple other people are doing a bigger study on nightmares after acute trauma, and just the interesting I won't go into all the details of that, but the interesting thing, again, about the cultural aspect, where I love this kind of role of being a cultural missionary, because I was part of this group, and they were doing all kinds of studies and all kinds of questionnaires, about a half hour, 45 minutes worth of questionnaires, and I suggested, well, maybe a lot of the people were having nightmares. I suggested, well, maybe we should ask them what they're dreaming about, what the content of the nightmares was, and everybody was like, amazingly, was like stunned, like really, why would we do that? And then we're like, oh, people aren't going to want to share their nightmares. And I said, just try, they will. And it turned, so we have this big database now of these nightmares after acute trauma, and it turned out everybody loved sharing their dreams, and because no one asked before. So that's just kind of a good illustration of kind of the cultural bias. So anyway, I didn't want, obviously I can talk longer, but I didn't want to go on and give people a chance to talk.